The Grand Conclave of Ethon Prime was the most powerful room in the known galaxy. It sat at the center of a space station so large that it had its own weather system. Inside, the walls were made from crystallized starlight, harvested from dying suns. The seats were carved from the bones of ancient ships that had sailed the void before most civilizations even knew fire. The room could hold 2,000 beings from across 47 different species, and today every single seat was filled. The occasion was important enough to bring them all together. Earth had applied for membership in the Galactic Council for the third time in 60 years. Ambassador Lyra Vasquez of Earth sat in the observation gallery above the main floor. She was not allowed on the floor itself. That was only for full members. She sat in the glass box, reserved for guests and outsiders and petitioners. She wore a simple dark uniform with the small blue and white patch of Earth stitched on her shoulder. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was calm. Her eyes watched everything. Below her, the representatives of 47 civilizations moved and buzzed and floated and crawled into their seats. The Volkai arrived in their black insectoid armor, their 6 arms folded tight against their bodies, their compound eyes catching light like broken mirrors. The Thavine drifted inside their pressurized environmental spheres, moving slow as clouds, their ancient bodies barely visible inside the swirling gas. The Maroon delegates walked in a tight cluster of 12, all sharing one collective mind, all moving with the exact same rhythm, like a single creature wearing 12 bodies. Council Speaker Draelvas took his position at the center podium. He was ethony tall and pale, with 4 long fingers on each hand and eyes that were completely silver. He tapped his staff against the floor twice, and the room fell silent with the kind of speed that only happens when everyone already knows who is in charge. He spoke in Galactic Standard, which every translator and plan in the room rendered perfectly into each species' native language. The Council recognizes the third application of the planet Earth, System Sol, Outer Spiral Arm, for full membership in the Galactic Council of Civilizations. He said, "The floor is open for assessment." The first to rise was High Representative Kess of the Volkai. She unfolded herself to her full height, which was nearly 3 meters, and placed a data crystal on the submission podium. The crystal projected a holographic report into the air above the floor, visible to everyone in the room, including Lyra in the gallery. The Volkai Biological and Threat Assessment Division has completed its 3rd review of the human species. Kess said. Her voice came out as a series of clicks that the translator rendered into flat, even tones. Our findings remain unchanged, and in fact have grown more concerning with each passing review. Humans are the only known sapient species in recorded galactic history to have nearly caused their own extinction, not once, but twice through their own deliberate actions. They fought wars using weapons capable of destroying their entire atmosphere. They poisoned their water, they burned their forests, they collapsed entire ecosystems for economic profit, and then held international conferences to argue about whether the collapse was real. There was a low ripple of sound across the chamber, something between laughter and horror, depending on the species making it. Kess continued, "In the 60 years since their first application, humans have not fundamentally changed. They have simply moved their conflicts into space. They have had 14 significant armed conflicts between their own nation-states. Since their first application, they have 3 separate active military presences beyond their home system, none of which were approved by this council. They are biologically driven by competition, aggression, and what their own psychologists describe as an almost compulsive need. Dominate their environment." She stepped back. The Volkai vote no. The next speaker was Elder Vaughn of the Thavine. The ancient gas dweller drifted forward inside its sphere, its voice coming out as a deep, low hum that the translator turned into slow, careful words. "The Thavine have observed humanity for 140 of their years." Vaughn said, "We have watched them with great interest and with great concern. In that time, we have seen remarkable things. They built a civilization from nothing. They reached the stars without help. They survived diseases, wars, resource collapses, political revolutions, and no fewer than 3 near-extinction events caused entirely by their own choices. And yet they are here, they survived all of it, but survival is not the same as wisdom. A creature that survives by burning everything around it is still dangerous even if it means no deliberate harm. The Thavine vote no. One by one, the representatives rose. The Maroon Collective stated that human individualism was fundamentally incompatible with galactic cooperative governance. The Pelari said that human emotional volatility made them unpredictable and therefore untrustworthy in high-stakes diplomatic situations. The Sauron reminded the chamber that a human vessel had accidentally triggered a gravitational anomaly in the Delvar system 2 years ago by running an unsanctioned FTL test near populated moon. The pilot had apparently done it on a dare. Each speaker sat down, and the no votes stacked up like stones. Lyra watched all of it from her glass box above. She did not shift in her seat. She did not check her communicator. She did not whisper to the aide sitting beside her. She simply watched with the same calm, steady expression she had worn since she sat down. When the final vote was cast, Speaker Draelvas read the count aloud. 41 votes against admission, 8 votes in favor, 2 abstentions. Earth's application for membership in the Galactic Council is denied. The chamber began to move again as delegates rose to leave their conversations, already turning to other business. Earth was not the only item on the agenda today. It was not even the most important one to most of them. It was a routine denial of a routine application from a species everyone had already agreed was not ready. Draelvas was gathering his documents when something made him look up. It was the human ambassador. She had stood from her seat in the gallery, and she was straightening her jacket with 2 careful movements. Her aide was already moving toward the exit, but Lyra herself was not moving, yet she was looking down at the chamber floor, and Draelvas found his silver eyes drawn to her face because something about her expression did not match the moment. She was smiling. Not the brittle, polite smile of someone hiding embarrassment, not the tight, controlled smile of a diplomat keeping their composure. It was something quieter than that, and something far harder to read. It was the kind of smile that belonged to someone who had just watched events unfold exactly the way they expected. Draelvas watched her for a moment longer than he intended to. Then she turned and walked out of the gallery without a word, without a gesture, without a single look back at the chamber that had just rejected her world for the 3rd time. The speaker stood at his podium for a moment after she was gone. He told himself he was simply reviewing his next agenda item. He told himself the expression on her face meant nothing. He told himself that the human ambassador was simply a professional, keeping her composure in a difficult moment. He was very good at telling himself things. But the smile stayed with him longer than he expected, and when he finally moved on to the next order of business, he found himself doing something he had not done in a long time. He found himself wondering what the other person in a conversation was actually thinking. He did not yet know that wondering that question about a human being was the first step toward understanding just how badly the council had miscalculated. And he did not yet know that the miscalculation had already begun to grow into something the galaxy had never seen before. The intelligence report arrived on Speaker Draelvas's desk 6 months after the vote. It was flagged routine, which meant it came from an automated monitoring system, and not from a live analyst. Routine reports were reviewed by junior staff first, and only passed up the chain if something unusual was found. Most routine reports never made it past the 3rd floor of the Council Intelligence Division. This one made it all the way to the speaker's private office in 4 hours. The analyst who sent it had written only 1 line of personal note at the top of the file before forwarding it. "Sir, I think you should see this yourself." Draelvas sat down and opened the file. The report was a 6-month activity summary of human deep space operations, standard tracking data, pulled from beacon signatures, jump trail residue, and the passive sensor networks the Council maintained throughout explored space. The data was supposed to show the slow and unremarkable activity of a species that had been denied interstellar community membership and was presumably licking its wounds. Instead, it showed something that made the speaker read the document 3 times before he accepted that he was reading it correctly. Human deep space activity had not slowed after the rejection. It had increased by over 300%. 31 new jump-capable vessels had been registered in human space in the 6 months. Since the vote, 14 of those were a class of ship that Council analysts had not seen before: long-range high-capacity vessels with extended life support systems and cargo holds large enough to transport not just goods, but entire communities of people. The humans were not retreating. They were moving outward. And the direction they were moving was not random. They were establishing new outpost colonies in a ring pattern along the outer boundary of Council-controlled space. But every single one of those outposts sat just outside Council jurisdiction, by a margin so precise that it could only have been deliberate. The humans had studied galactic boundary law carefully enough to know exactly where the Council's authority ended, and they were building right on that line, like a contractor who knows exactly where the property then sits before pouring a foundation. Drael Voss called a closed session with the Intelligence Division's senior staff. The following morning, he did not tell them why he wanted to see if they had noticed what he noticed. They had not. But when he showed them the data, the room went very quiet very fast. "They're not applying anymore," said Senior Analyst Torin, a young Ethoni with sharp eyes and the habit of speaking before she had fully organized her thoughts. "They're not waiting for us, they're just going around us." "Show me the diplomatic logs," Drael Voss said. "All human outreach activity for the past 18 months. The logs took 2 hours to compile because nobody had been watching them closely. The Galactic Council's diplomatic monitoring system tracked interactions between Council members and other Council members. It tracked interactions between Council members and applicant civilizations. It did not robustly track what applicant civilizations were doing with the dozens of smaller species that the Council had never formally inducted and largely ignored. When the compiled logs appeared on the briefing room display, the room went even quieter. In the 18 months before the vote, Earth had made formal diplomatic contact with 19 non-Council civilizations. 17 of those contacts had progressed to signed bilateral agreements covering trade, mutual defense, information sharing, and infrastructure development. 17 separate species who had never been offered a seat at the Council table, who had spent generations being diplomatically invisible, had received offers from humanity and had said yes. The Council had spent decades studying humanity's capacity for conflict and aggression. It had never once commissioned a study on humanity's capacity for making friends. "How did we miss this?" said Division Chief Marek, a Volkai veteran, who had been in intelligence work for 40 years. His tone was not angry. It was the flat, stunned tone of someone trying to understand how a calculation they trusted had produced a completely wrong answer. "Because we were watching for weapons," Torin said quietly. "We were watching their shipyards, their military exercises, their border skirmishes. We were watching for signs of danger. We were looking for teeth. We were not watching for handshakes." Drael Voss stood and walked to the display. He looked at the network of connections spreading out from the small blue dot of Earth across the map like roots from a tree. Each line was a relationship. Each relationship was a promise. Each promise was a brick in something that had no name yet, but was already clearly a structure. "Pull the communication archive," he said. "I want every outgoing transmission from Ambassador Vasquez's office from the day of the vote forward." Most of the transmissions were administrative reports filed with Earth's government, scheduling confirmations, meeting notes. But near the bottom of the stack from the morning after the vote, there was a single message sent to all 17 partner civilizations. It was brief. The message said that the Council had voted no again. It said that Earth respected the Council's decision. It said that Earth had no interest in forcing itself into a room that did not want it there. It said that Earth was grateful for the partnerships it had already built, and that those partnerships would continue and grow regardless of what any large governing body decided. And then at the very end of the message, in the same plain, practical tone as everything before it, the message said one more thing. It said that Earth had always believed the galaxy was big enough for more than one kind of table, and that it intended to keep building. Dreylvas read that line 4 times. He was not a dramatic being. He had spent 60 years in galactic politics, and he had trained himself to receive information calmly and process it rationally. But something about that single sentence from a human diplomat, written the morning after her world's third rejection, hit him in a way he had not expected. Because it was not a threat. It was not angry, it was not bitter, it was not the language of a wounded civilization vowing revenge. It was something far more unsettling than any of those things. It was a simple statement of intention from a people who had already decided what they were going to do, and were simply informing others of the fact. He set the file down and looked at his senior staff. "I want full-spectrum monitoring on all human activity effective immediately," he said. "Every jump trail, every transmission, every diplomatic contact. I want reports on my desk every 72 hours, and I want them flagged priority, not routine." "Sir," said Marek slowly, "if we increase monitoring to that level, and the humans detect it, they may interpret it as hostile surveillance that could damage any chance of future negotiations." Dreylvas looked at the map again, at the quiet spreading network of lines, connecting Earth to 17 other civilizations, while the Council had been busy congratulating itself on keeping the dangerous species out. "They already know we're watching them," he said. "They have always known we were watching them. They built all of this while we were watching, and we still missed it." He picked up his documents and moved toward the door. "Start the monitoring. I will draft a full briefing for the security circle by end of day." He stepped out into the corridor, and the door closed behind him. For a long moment he stood still. He was thinking about a smile. He was thinking about a human woman standing in a glass gallery above a chamber that had just told her world no for the third time, and smiling like someone watching a plan arrive exactly on schedule. He had told himself that smile meant nothing. He was beginning to understand that the smile had meant everything. The Reth Dominion did not ask permission for anything it never had in 400 years of recorded contact with the wider galaxy. The Reth had sent exactly two kinds of messages to other civilizations: demands and notifications. The demands came before they took something, the notifications came after. The only difference between the two was timing. When 40 Reth warships entered the Kelvar corridor, without announcement, without treaty approval, and without any communication at all, the three small civilizations living in the systems along that corridor did not panic because they had been expecting something like this for years. They panicked because they had spent those years asking the Galactic Council for a mutual defense agreement, and the Council had spent those same years tabling the request, recommending further study, and forming a subcommittee. The subcommittee had met 11 times and produced a report that was currently sitting in a document queue waiting to be formally received. When the distress signal from the Kelvar corridor reached Ethon Prime, the Council convened an emergency session within 4 hours that was considered fast by Council standards. Speaker Dreylvas opened the floor for response proposals. The Volkai military representative outlined 3 possible options and their associated risks. The Thavine elder requested that any military consideration be preceded by a full diplomatic review. The Marun collective stated that the situation required consensus before action could be ethically justified. 17 speakers rose in sequence to discuss the severity of the crisis, the importance of proportional response, the need for clear legal authority before any fleet movement, and the potential long-term diplomatic consequences of acting too quickly. The discussion lasted 9 hours. At the end of 9 hours, the Council had agreed in principle that something should be done, and had approved the formation of a rapid response working group to determine what that something should be. The working group was scheduled to meet in 48 hours. The humans had already moved. The Council learned about it not from a human communication, but from a Reth transmission. The Reth flagship in the Kelvar corridor sent a terse 3-line message to Reth Command. It was intercepted by a Council listening post. It said that an unknown fleet had dropped out of FTL between the Reth Armada and the target systems. It said the fleet was human and coalition. It said that a transmission had been received from the human command vessel, and that the Reth were withdrawing pending review of the transmission content. 11 hours after the distress signal had reached Ethon Prime, the crisis was over. The working group met anyway, because it had already been scheduled. Nobody in the room spoke for a long time when the update was given. The Thavine Elder's pressurized sphere drifted gently in the air conditioning. Current, the Volkai representative, sat completely still, which for a 6-limbed insectoid was the equivalent of staring with an open mouth. The working group filed a report noting that the situation had been resolved by non-council actors and recommending a formal inquiry into how human and coalition vessels had arrived in the Kelvar corridor so quickly. Drael Voss sent an immediate request for a meeting with the Human Coalition's senior military representative. The meeting was granted within hours, which itself was remarkable, because the Council had spent 60 years making humanity wait for every single meeting, every single document review, every single procedural acknowledgement. The speed of the response felt pointed, though the human side was too professional to say so. The meeting took place via secure holographic link. The human on the screen was Admiral Sun Akefer. He was a broad-shouldered, dark-skinned man with close-cut gray hair, and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have been in enough dangerous situations that nothing surprises them anymore. He wore a plain uniform with no decorative rank markings beyond a small flag of Earth on his chest. He looked like someone who had decided a long time ago that he did not need anything on his clothes to tell people who he was. Drael Voss thanked him for responding quickly. He then asked, without diplomatic softening, exactly what had been said in the transmission sent to the Reth flagship. Admiral Akefer looked at him with calm, flat eyes. "We reminded them of what happened to the last empire that ignored a human warning," he said. Drael Voss waited for more. No more came. "That is the entire content of the message," the speaker said. "The relevant part," Akefer said. "And what did happen to the last empire that ignored a human warning?" The Admiral's expression did not change. "I'd recommend pulling your historical archives on the Coven Reach conflict, the Draven Boundary War, and the Sethari expansion attempt. Your analysts will find the answer there." Drael Voss pulled those archives the same night. He assigned 4 senior historians to the task and told them to report back within 24 hours. They reported back in 9, because what they found was not buried or obscure. It was simply data that nobody in the Council had ever thought to compile into a single document before, because nobody had ever thought the information was related. The Coven Reach conflict had begun when a mid-tier expansionist civilization called the Coven pushed into human-adjacent territory and destroyed 2 human research stations. The humans had warned them twice. The Coven had not taken the warnings seriously. The conflict that followed lasted 11 months, and at the end of it, the Coven Reach civilization existed only in historical records. The Draven Boundary War had started when the Draven ignored 4 increasingly direct human diplomatic messages about contested mining rights. The war had lasted 6 months. The Draven still existed, but had lost 60% of their fleet and had not attempted military expansion in 112 years. The Sethari expansion attempt had ended before it became a war entirely, because the Sethari had apparently learned from watching the previous 2 cases and had chosen to negotiate. When the first human warning arrived, they were one of the 17 civilizations now in the human coalition. The historians presented their findings in a single document, with a summary line at the top that Drael Voss read standing at his desk at 3 in the morning station time. The summary said, "In every recorded instance of direct military conflict initiated against human interests, the human side has achieved strategic victory. The average duration of such conflicts is 8.3 months. The average outcome for the initiating party is significant and permanent reduction in military and political capacity. No civilization that has engaged in direct sustained military conflict with humanity has subsequently attempted to do so again." Drael Voss set the document down. He walked to his window and looked out at the stars, which from the station looked like salt scattered on black cloth. He thought about the Council's risk assessment of humanity, the one that said humans were volatile, unpredictable, dangerous. He thought about how the assessment had been built entirely around the question of whether humans might start something. Nobody had ever built an assessment around what happened when they finished it. He thought about 40 Wraith warships turning around in 11 hours after a single transmission from a human admiral, who had not even thought it worth his time to quote the message in full. He thought about the smile on Ambassador Vasquez's face in the gallery above the chamber 6 months ago. And then he did something he had not done in a very long time. He picked up a direct comm channel and called the intelligence division in the middle of the night. "I want a complete profile," he said when Torin answered, still half asleep. "Not a threat assessment, a complete profile, every conflict, every alliance, every warning given, and what happened afterward, every promise made, and whether it was kept every time a human diplomat was dismissed, and what they did next." There was a pause on the line. "Sir," Torin said carefully, "that profile is going to be very long." "I know," Drael Voss said. "I suspect that is part of the point." He closed the channel and stood alone in his office in the dark. Outside the Kelvar corridor was quiet. The 3 small civilizations there were safe tonight, not because the Council had acted, but because a coalition that did not yet have a name had moved faster than anyone expected, and had said something to the most feared military power on that border that had made 40 warships turn around without a shot being fired. The Council had spent 60 years studying what humans might do if they were allowed inside. Nobody had thought to study what they would build if they were kept outside. That mistake was becoming very expensive very fast. The second emergency session of the Galactic Council in 3 months was called without a public agenda. It was listed in the official scheduling system only as a closed security review, which was the Council's way of saying something had gone wrong, and they did not want anyone outside the chamber to know how wrong it was. All 47 member representatives were required to attend in person, no proxy votes, no remote holographic links. The Council chamber was swept for listening devices 3 times before the session opened that alone told the delegates everything they needed to know about the mood of the Speaker's office. Drael Voss stood at the center podium, and he did not go through the usual ceremonial opening. He did not tap his staff. He did not recite the traditional greeting of the convened body. He looked at the assembled representatives of the most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy, and he simply began. "The human coalition now counts 31 member civilizations," he said. The room was already quiet. It got quieter. "We held our last vote on Earth's membership application 7 months ago. The human network of bilateral relationships included 17 civilizations in the 7 months. Since that vote, they have added 14 more. Every new member is a species. This council has categorized at some point as peripheral, non-strategic, or insufficiently developed for formal induction." He paused and looked around the room. "In other words, every new member of the human coalition is a species we ignored. And the humans did not." High Representative Kess of the Volkai straightened in her seat, her compound eyes catching the chamber light. "The question before us is whether this constitutes a security threat. The human coalition has not attacked any council member. It has not issued any hostile declarations. It has not violated any galactic law. The Kelvar intervention was technically legal, under the mutual defense provisions of their bilateral agreements. The humans cannot be censured for acting within the law. The question is not whether they broke the law, said the Maroon collective representative, all 12 bodies speaking in unsettling unison. The question is what they are building and whether we understand it. That landed in the room and stayed there. Because the honest answer that everyone in the chamber knew but nobody had yet said aloud was no, they did not understand it. They had the data, they had the monitoring reports, they had the intelligence files that Drael Voss had ordered compiled. After the Reth incident, those files were now the longest active dossier in the Council Intelligence Division's history. And they were still growing. But having data was not the same as understanding. And what was happening in the space beyond the Council's borders was something that none of their analytical frameworks had been built to process. The Thavin elder spoke next, and it spoke slowly the way it always did. But today the slowness felt less like the rhythm of an ancient species, and more like someone choosing each word with great care. We have been discussing the human species for 60 years, in terms of what they might do to us if we let them in. The elder said, I would like to propose that we have been asking the wrong question entirely, and that this is why we find ourselves here tonight surprised and uncertain, when we have had 6 decades of observation to work with. The pressurized sphere drifted slightly as the elder continued. The right question was never what will humans do if we accept them. The right question was what will humans do if we do not, and we never asked it, because we assumed the answer was nothing. We assumed they would wait. We assumed they would keep applying. We assumed that our table was the only table that mattered, and that any species with sense would simply keep trying to reach it. The chamber was very still. We were wrong, the elder said simply. They did not keep waiting. They went and built their own table, and they were very quiet about it, and very patient, and now their table has 31 seats and growing, and we are sitting here in an emergency session trying to understand how it happened. The representative from the Pelari civilization, a species of tall blue-skinned beings known for their precise mathematical thinking, raised their hand and spoke in the clipped, careful tone of someone reporting a calculation result. The current trajectory of coalition growth, if maintained, will see the human network exceed council membership numbers within 14 months. At the current rate of new diplomatic contacts and partnership agreements, the human coalition will represent more total populated systems than this council within 2 years. The Pelari representative set down their data tablet. I want to be clear that this is not a projection based on assumptions. It is a mathematical extrapolation of recorded activity. The humans have not changed their pace. They have been consistent since the day after the vote. The growth rate now is the same as it was 6 months ago. They have not accelerated because they have not needed to. That produced the kind of silence that has weight to it. Division Chief Marak of the Volkai intelligence community spoke up from the gallery level, where the senior staff observers sat. We have also completed the conflict history profile. The speaker requested, after the Kelvar incident, the findings are significant. He transferred the document summary to the main display. In reviewing 140 years of human external relations, we found that in every instance where humans issued a formal diplomatic warning that was subsequently ignored, the outcome was decisive and unfavorable for the party that ignored the warning. In every instance where humans offered partnership that was accepted, the partnership held. In every instance where humans made a promise in a diplomatic agreement, the promise was honored. We found no recorded exceptions to any of these patterns across 140 years and interactions with over 60 civilizations. Cass turned her head slowly toward the display. None. None, Marak confirmed. Their record of keeping agreements is statistically the most consistent of any spacefaring civilization in our database, more consistent than council members, more consistent than the Thavin who have been in diplomatic practice for 3,000 years. Another long silence. It was the representative of a small council member called the Versh, who had spoken only twice in full chamber session in 20 years, who said the thing that broke the silence open. We have to offer them membership again." The room reacted the way rooms react when someone says something obvious that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say first. There was movement and sound, and the particular social discomfort of a group of beings who have just had their position clearly stated back to them. Drael Voss raised a hand, and the room settled. "A proposal has been drafted by the Speaker's office in consultation with the Security Circle." He said Earth would be offered full membership in the Galactic Council, with a permanent seat on the Security Circle and full voting rights effective immediately upon acceptance. He looked around the room. The offer would be communicated to Ambassador Vasquez directly through a priority diplomatic channel. The Council's position would be that we recognize the changed landscape of galactic relations and wish to build a stronger future together. The Thavine elder spoke again. "And what do we do if she says no?" The room went completely silent for the third time that evening. It was a question. None of the proposals and counter-proposals and security reviews had actually addressed, because it was a question that had never needed to be asked before the Council offered membership the applicant accepted, or was denied. That was the direction. The power in that transaction had always flowed. The idea that the answer might come back as something other than grateful acceptance had simply not been part of anyone's thinking. Drael Voss said, "We proceed with the offer, and we respond to whatever answer we receive with appropriate flexibility." That was diplomatic language for "we do not know, and we are hopping. We do not have to find out." The motion passed 43-4. The priority diplomatic channel was opened that same evening. A message was transmitted to Ambassador Lyra Vasquez's official office on the Human Outpost Station, just outside Council space, informing her that the Galactic Council wished to offer Earth full membership and requesting her earliest convenience for a formal discussion. The response came back in 40 minutes. Not from Vasquez directly, but from her office assistant, a polite professional message that said Ambassador Vasquez had received the Council's communication with appreciation and would be happy to discuss the offer. But the message also said that she would need to consult with her coalition partners before making any decisions, and that she expected to have a preliminary response for the Council in approximately 3 weeks. Drael Voss read the response standing at his desk in the same spot where he had stood reading intelligence reports for months now. He read it twice. Then he sat down very slowly in his chair. Because that message had just told the Galactic Council something it had never been told before in its 300-year history. It had told the Council that the decision about whether to join was not Earth's alone to make. It had told the Council that there were 31 other civilizations whose opinions Ambassador Vasquez considered relevant to her answer. It had told the Council that the question of membership was no longer a conversation between one applicant and one body. It had told the Council that humanity had already built something that had its own weight, its own voice, and its own process, and that the Council was now on the outside of that process, waiting for a response. The Speaker sat alone in his office and thought about 60 years of votes and reports and assessments and subcommittees and risk evaluations. And he thought about what it felt like to be the one waiting for an answer for a change. Ambassador Lyra Vasquez arrived at Ethon Prime not as a petitioner this time. She arrived as a co-host. The summit had been her idea, or rather it had been the natural result of the response her office had sent 3 weeks after the Council's membership offer. The preliminary response had been longer than anyone expected, and its contents had been circulated among the security circle with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for military threat assessments, because, in a quiet way, that is exactly what it was. The response acknowledged the Council's generous offer. It expressed genuine appreciation for the changed position. It noted that Earth and its partners had discussed the matter thoroughly. It then said that Earth would be pleased to accept membership under a revised framework, and it laid out what that revised framework looked like in precise and courteous detail. It was not a counteroffer in the traditional sense, A counteroffer implies that one party holds the position of power, and the other is negotiating for a better deal. This was something different. This was a set of conditions written by a coalition of 31 civilizations who had looked at the current structure of galactic governance and identified everything that was wrong with it, and then written down what a better version would look like. They had been apparently thinking about it for a while. The document was extremely thorough. The Galactic Council could choose to accept the framework and welcome humanity and the coalition into an expanded and restructured governing body, or it could decline and allow the existing division of galactic civilization to become permanent. The document did not say this in threatening language. It said it the way an engineer describes structural options: one path, the other path. Here are the load-bearing differences. The Security Circle had debated for 4 days before recommending to the full council that they accept and negotiate details. The full council had voted 39 in favor, 6 against, 2 abstaining. Now Vasquez sat across a real table from Speaker Drael Voss and 12 other senior delegates in the negotiation chamber of Ethon Prime, and for the first time in 60 years of Earth's relationship with the council, she was sitting on the floor and not in the gallery above it. The room felt different at floor level. She had always known it would. The negotiations took 11 days of working through the details of what the new framework would actually look like in practice, how the old council structure would be reformed, how the new member civilizations would be integrated, how voting representation would be recalculated to reflect actual population and system counts rather than the historical tier system that had conveniently always placed the founding members at the top. The Human Coalition's legal team had clearly spent considerable time on the mathematics of fair representation, because every time a council delegate suggested a formula that would dilute the coalition's collective voice, the human team had a counter-formula ready within minutes that was both more mathematically defensible and more difficult to argue against without sounding openly self-interested. By the 7th day, several council delegates had started arriving early to the sessions. By the 10th day, the Thavine Elder had privately told its aide that the human negotiating team was the most prepared group of diplomats it had encountered in its 3,000-year diplomatic career, and that it meant that as the highest possible form of praise. On the 11th day, the framework was signed. It was called the Galactic Accord. Vasquez had suggested the name in the final session, and nobody had objected, because it was a good name. It said what it was. It did not try to make itself sound more important than it was. The Accord restructured the Council into an expanded body with proportional representation, established a new joint security framework that formalized coalition arrangements like the one that had resolved the Kelvar incident, and created a permanent seat on the new governance circle for every civilization above a minimum population threshold, which happened to include all 31 members of the Human Coalition and 19 additional species who had previously been classified as peripheral and non-strategic. The signing ceremony was public and formal and very well attended. Vasquez signed for Earth with the same calm expression she had worn in the gallery above the chamber 11 months ago. She did not make a long speech. She said that she was grateful to the Council for its willingness to build something better, and that she looked forward to the work ahead. And then she sat down, and the next delegate signed, and the ceremony continued. Afterward, there was a reception in the Great Hall of the station, where delegates from 78 civilizations stood together for the first time in the same room as formal equals. The food tables were an extraordinary collection of items prepared for dozens of different biologies and dietary requirements. The catering had been organized by the Human Delegation Support Team, and it was excellent. Drael Voss found himself standing near one of the large viewports, looking out at the stars, holding a drink. He was not really tasting when he heard footsteps beside him, and knew, without looking, who it was. Vasquez stood next to him, and also looked out at the stars for a moment without speaking. "I want to ask you something," Drael Voss said, And I want you to know I am asking as an individual, and not as the speaker of this body, because, as the speaker, I suspect I am not supposed to admit that I do not know the answer." She glanced at him with the faint trace of a smile, asked, "Was any of this planned?" He said, "From the beginning, from the first vote from 60 years ago, was there a strategy, or did it develop as it went?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the stars the way people look at things when they are deciding how honest to be. "The first rejection, we were just hurt." She said, "We genuinely believed we were ready, and we genuinely believed that being ready was enough. We did not understand. Yet that being ready and being wanted were two different things. The second rejection, we were angry. We spent years after that arguing internally about what we were doing wrong, and whether we should change ourselves to fit what the council wanted. And that argument went nowhere good." She paused. "By the third application, we had stopped arguing. We had been watching for 60 years, and we had started noticing something. We noticed that the species the council rejected or ignored or forgot were not actually weak or unready or dangerous. They were just not useful to the founding members, so they had been set aside. And those species had things to offer. Each of them had something, and nobody was offering them anything in return for it." Dreylvas said nothing. "So we started talking to them," Vasquez said. "Not because we had a grand strategy, not because we had decided to build a rival power to the council. We talked to them because they were there, and because nobody else was talking to them, and because humans are not very good at seeing someone who needs a conversation and walking past them." She smiled more fully now. "The structure came later, the coalition came later, the accord came much later. In the beginning, we were just making friends." He looked at her for a long moment. "And the patience," he said. 60 years of waiting, 3 rejections. You maintained your direction for 60 years without breaking from it, without retaliating, without escalating. That is not something that happens by accident. That requires something I am not sure I have a word for." "We have a word for it," she said. "We have several, actually." She looked back at the stars. "But the simple one is this: we did not wait because we were patient. We waited because we were busy. And when you are busy enough doing the right things, time moves differently." They stood in comfortable silence for a while. Around them, the reception continued. Representatives of civilizations that had spent years ignoring each other were having actual conversations. Some of them were laughing, the sound of different kinds of laughter in different registers and tones and pitches mixing together in the great hall of Ethon Prime was not something that had ever been heard in that room before. It was an unusual sound. It was a good sound. Dreylvas finally said, "The council made a significant error in judgment." "Yes," Vasquez agreed without any particular emphasis. She did not say it to wound him. She said it the way you agree with a statement that is simply true. "We studied the wrong things," he said. "We studied your capacity for destruction. We should have studied your capacity for connection." She did not argue with that. "What would you have found if you had studied it correctly?" she asked, not as a challenge but as a genuine question. He thought about it carefully, the way he thought about everything. "I think we would have found that the most dangerous thing about your species is not that you fight," he said. "I think we would have found that the most dangerous thing about you is that when you are rejected, you do not collapse, and you do not attack. You get to work, and you do not stop." Vasquez looked at him, and her expression was not triumphant. It was something quieter than that, something that looked like recognition. "That is probably the most accurate thing anyone outside our species has ever said about us," she told him. He nodded once. "I will ensure it is included in the updated profile," he said. She laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that happens when something strikes a person as genuinely funny. Rather than politely amusing, it was a warm sound, and it echoed slightly in the viewport alcove. And a few nearby delegates glanced over and then went back to their own conversations. The galaxy outside the window was the same as it had always been, vast and cold, and full of light from suns so far away that the light arriving at this window right now had left its source before Earth had learned to write. But the room behind them was different than it had been yesterday. And tomorrow it would be different again. That was the thing about humans that the Galactic Council had spent 60 years failing to understand, and was only now beginning to learn. They did not just survive what came at them. They changed what came next. And they had been doing it so long and so consistently, and so quietly, that by the time anyone noticed, the world had already shifted beneath their feet, and the humans were standing exactly where they had planned to be all along, not because they had forced their way there, but because they had simply refused for 60 years to stand anywhere else.